All right, hello. Here's the scapula. And with the scapula, it's obviously one of, well, the main bone of two that make up the pectoral girdle. It accepts the humerus and it also articulates with the clavicle. And what I'm going to do, like I've done before, is I'll first just go over the names of things, and then in a second part, I'll talk about functional and medical applications of the parts that I've introduced you to. All right, so this bone overall is called the scapula, and I think what I'll do is I'll just start with that articulation surface that the clavicle uses. You'll notice that there's this part that kind of rises and it kind of curves anteriorly, and there's a bit of a smooth surface there. It's not condylar because there isn't that much movement at it, but there is a flat articulating surface, and that's called the acromion. So that's the acromion of the scapula. Then there's this obvious ridge when you look at the posterior part of the scapula. This is called the scapular spine, and it divides this whole kind of main, what we might call the blade of the scapula. This scapular spine divides it into two parts, and these each get called a fossa. They're about kind of like a ditched out part in the bone, and these names will make sense to you. This is called the Supraspinous Fossa. That means superior to the spine, ditchy part is basically what that name means, Supraspinous Fossa. Then this is called Infraspinous Fossa, and that is here below this scapular spine, so inferior to the spine. Then if you take a look over here, this is kind of an obvious articulating surface as well. It's not too ditchy, but this gets called the glenoid fossa. It is a little bit of a ditch, and it makes up a bit, but not all, of what we would call the whole glenoid cavity. The glenoid cavity has a lot of soft tissues to make it more of a socket shape. Okay, so glenoid fossa. Then nearby here's another look at the acromion. Here is called the Coracoid Process. Now remember, on the mandible we had a coronoid process and a condyloid process. So just be aware of these words. Some of them are a little bit similar to each other. Okay. Here, along the superior portion of the scapula, it's called the superior notch, or the suprascapular notch. There's a suprascapular nerve that passes by there. Sorry, that's a little bit of a functional thing, but I couldn't help myself. So then other parts of the scapula end up being attachment parts. Maybe it's medial or lateral. Now, one thing you should be able to spot when you look at a scapular is, well, which way is up, and hopefully you'll know that this is the superior, this smaller part of the blade is superior, and thus this would be superior, this is inferior. But then also that this is lateral and this is medial. And the thing that tells you really is this glenoid fossa. That's where the humerus is attaching. That's on the side of your body. So lateral, medial. And so then that makes this the medial border or medial margin, and then this is the lateral border or lateral margin. This is called the inferior angle. And then the last fossa to look at, you have to turn the scapula over and look at the anterior portion of the scapula, and this is called the subscapular fossa. All right, and then for some functional aspects of the anatomy that I've just told you about. Now we already know that the glenoid fossa is where the humerus attaches, and there would be cartilage, fibrocartilage that is associated with this. We'll talk about that when we talk about lecture. We have the acromion, and like I said before, the clavicle attaches there. And so this is the place of what's called the AC joint. And if someone has a separated shoulder, it's because there is a separation from the acromion and the clavicle. And it often involves the breaking of some ligaments that help support the shoulder. For instance, on the coracoid process, there's 4 ligaments that help stabilize the shoulder that attach to there, and like some go from here to here. And so the coracoid process helps with the stabilization of the soft tissues of the shoulder and the scapular spine, and the acromion, they also have some ligaments. But yeah, this is where the clavicle attaches. Remember, we had these fossas. There was the supraspinous fossa. There's a muscle that we will learn called the supraspinatus that sits in here. It originates off of here. There's a muscle called the infraspinatus. There's a muscle called the subscapularis. So all 3 of these fossas have a muscle that is making their shape. And all of those muscles are a part of what's called the rotator cuff muscles that help to also be muscles to stabilize the shoulder. Oh, an interesting thing, the coracoid process, to go back to this, it gets its name being the shape of a raven's beak. Somehow coracoid is in reference to a raven. Okay, that's interesting. Thanks, Dr. Raylman, for that. Okay, I think I mentioned this notch is where the suprascapular nerve passes by, but this is called the suprascapular notch, or the superior notch there. Then for these edges of the scapula, we had the lateral border, the medial border. There are muscles that we'll be learning that attach to that. The lateral margin here, it's kind of near where your humerus comes in. It's kind of at the armpit region. It's sometimes called the axillary border, just because that's the axillary region. Your armpit area is called the axillary region. Part of the triceps originates off of there. For this medial margin, we'll be learning about the rhomboideus. We'll be learning about something called the serratus ventralis in a cat, but in a human it would be called serratus anterior, and that attaches to the medial margin. And then there's a muscle that we'll learn called teres major, and that attaches to this inferior angle. So there's some of the functional aspects of the scapula. Ta-da!